When it comes to the Sunnah of the Prophet, Muslims tend to put much emphasis on his physical Sunnah, material Sunnah, the way he brushed his teeth and the way he, dressed himself and the way he wore a turban and he, I don't think this is what the Quran is asking us to do. We live in a different time, 1400 years from the Prophet. The circumstances, the conditions are completely different. The Prophet lived in a society, he built the mosque himself. Adjacent to the mosque was his house. He had multiple wives. He had companions and family who supported him. And his lifestyle was different. The Quran is not asking us to follow his lifestyle. He's asking us to follow his manners, his akhlaq. We tend to follow the Prophet in his dress code, but we don't follow him in his tolerance. We rush to reject others, do takfir of others. I'll tell you a story. 3 weeks ago I was in Tunisia, and I was moving from one city into another, so the taxi driver, he said, I have a friend. Would you mind if I take my friend with me? I said, no. So the friend had just finished the prayers in the mosque, and he came with us to join us, going back to the capital, and we were involved in a discussion, and he realized that I follow a different tradition. So he was very agitated, and he said something very insulting. And I said to him, is this the result of your prayers inside the mosque earlier, a few minutes ago? The prayers should teach us your tolerance and respect, even if we differ. Besides, you don't know me, you don't know anything about me. You just heard some rumors, and then you are, So we must emphasize, when it comes to the Sunnah of the Prophet, yes, it's good to get dressed like him and eat like him. But these are not the most important things. The most important, his tolerance, his forgiveness, his open-mindedness, his willingness to reach out to his enemies. This is the real Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sunnah. So maybe Dr. Khaled and Sayyid Moustafa, you can inform me on the theological side of this topic of competence. When is somebody mentally competent? And I think the idea of a disease state is sometimes thought to be, well, then this person, it's like, rufi'at al-aqlam, this person is not held accountable for the things they do. And in the case of drug addiction, for example, I remember this memory just happened to me now, but back when I was in grad school in Michigan, there was a conference that we had, and it involved like Muslims and mental health, and it was an old one before, this movement had gotten, is when we went to Ohio, and there was a question that came up about if there was somebody who was a recovering addict and they were going through rehabilitation, drug rehabilitation, and they were getting detoxed, so some drugs stay in the system for a while, in the body for a while, so they require detoxification. They have to be, typically they're in a residential facility, they're kind of monitored, and over time they're going through withdrawal symptoms, they're waiting for the drug to leave the body. And then they're still addicted, by the way. Even once the drug is left the body, you still have the addiction, which means you crave it, and as soon as you get it, you can't stop yourself. You keep taking it more, so the addiction is there. And the question was, well, what if an addict wants to become Muslim? Do we give them the Shahada, or do we wait for them to clear out of the addiction first? And, in other words, do we teach them the declaration of faith and have them declare their belief in Islam, or do we wait until they're no longer considered an addict and then they have the mental capacity to do something like that? And there were differing opinions on this, I remember at the time. For me, there has to be a distinction made between the actual intoxication moment when you're high on the drugs And I would agree, and I think most would agree, that a person who is high on drugs and is not perceiving reality normal, they're not in a state of being mentally able to make decisions and, have all these things, be responsible for their actions. Now, the steps that led up to that, okay, that could be free will, could be in there, but once they're intoxicated, once they're under the effect of the drug, but once you're going through detox, most of the time you're not high, you're still an addict, you know what your weaknesses are, you know what you need to stay away from, but if you're not high at that moment, your brain is not intoxicated, then you have your cognitive faculties. Dr. Khaled mentioned the idea of punitive measures against consumption of alcohol. But I think even in his question, which was very nicely delineated, your question kind of had the answer, which was, you mentioned consumption of alcohol, and then you mentioned some people consider addiction to be a disease. So addiction and consumption are two different things. So people consume alcohol, people even get drunk, to the point that their intellect, their aql is not functioning. But they're not necessarily addicted to the alcohol. So not everybody who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic. That's a certain percentage of the population. And I think there's hikmah behind, there's some wisdom behind those punitive measures, because we're trying to save the human body and the intellect, more importantly. One of my mashayikh who came from Hadramaut, from Yemen, he came and visited California, and we were driving, I think, one night on a Thursday night is party night in Los Angeles, and people were lining up at the clubs and the bars, and he asked, where are all these people lining up? And they were explaining they're lining up for parties to go and drink. And he said something that always stuck with me. He said that people are standing in line because they are going to go get drunk. And they're doing that because the ego is taking its revenge on the aql. The intellect did not do a good enough job during the week in guiding the nafs to be as beautiful as the ruh. And so the nafs is saying, fine, I don't need you, aql. At the end of the week, I'm going to take you out, and we're going to go get drunk. And now you have no intellectual capacity. But in addiction, the distinction is that the person, if they're exposed to the stimuli, they cannot help it. They go back into it. And they will even do irrational things to get a hold of that. And so they have to be completely removed from it. And their state is a little bit different. And I believe there was an example from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There was a man who wasn't like the other people who would just drink or show up to prayer drunk. He could not stop drinking. And the other Sahaba would even curse him. And the Prophet ﷺ said, don't help shaitan against your brother. Like, this man has a different condition. And you're actually inspiring those demonic elements if you keep making fun of him and don't let him think he can get out of this, and you don't give him any hope and you just curse him. So I think there must be some distinction. I don't know how the theologians look at it, between an addict who has, there's even genetic, ties now. Alcoholism in particular runs in families. So if you had alcoholic family members in your lineage, there's a high chance you may be alcoholic, which means you have to stay away from it more than the other people. Other people could maybe drink and then get a slap on the wrist for drinking, but this person, if he drinks, he goes down the wrong path immediately. So I wonder if there's some way that the jurists would have to look at that, the behavior of the addict.
We have a very famous jurisprudential maxim in Islam. It's among both traditions, both aisles. Al-hududu tudra'u bil-shubuhat. The punishment is prevented with the smallest doubt. If we have the smallest doubt about this person, we stop the punishment. And the general view of that person in Islam is not perceived as a criminal, but as a victim. Islam does not look at people as being criminal and he wants to condemn them to punishment right away. But as victims of the societal circumstances, as parents, the school, the neighborhood, the social media. So Islam tries to heal the person, not to put an end to his dignity or to his life or to his career. And therefore, not only with someone who drinks, we have to be merciful and understand his situation, not to condone him, but also not to condemn him at the same time. Try to heal him, try to save him. I go further in trying to understand the homosexuals too. In Muslim societies nowadays, in many Muslim societies, not all, once they find out that someone is homosexual, he or she would be condemned immediately to hellfire, to damnation, to deviation, But this should not be the case. We should try to understand the circumstances. What made them follow this tradition? Is this genetic, really genetic? I don't know. Is this societal influence on him? Is this the encouragement of the society? We have to understand that. And we must put healing and recovery before punishment. God came and the Prophet came, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. He's a source of healing and blessing and mercy. He's not a source of condemning people and making them feel ashamed of themselves. Those people, they have weaknesses. And Islam, advises us to understand people's weaknesses and try to find some loopholes to save them and to protect them and to bring them back. You have to say something.
I agree.
The other question about brain damage. Dr. Khaled, you asked about, is it true that a certain damage to the brain could result in, for example, inability to make proper decisions? The frontal lobe in particular is an important part of the brain. Some people liken it to the nausea, the forelock. Of course, there's always du'as that Allah can guide that for us so that we make correct decisions. But it's shown people who've been damaged in this part of the brain, they have increased impulsivity. They cannot inhibit some of these lower desires or lower impulses, and make poor decisions, and sometimes even the personality changes. They become maybe ruder or even less, I guess, aware of social norms and what's appropriate etiquette in certain situations and things like that. If the damage is severe enough, the person really, has very little control of over their own behaviors, and they require some type of supervision. Just to be safe, otherwise they may do things to harm themselves or others inadvertently. If the damage is not that severe, some people have mild strokes, mild brain injuries, they can learn ways to cope with it. And that may be where working with, a therapist or a professional can kind of help them with their cognitive rehabilitation. They may always have certain weaknesses, but they can kind of learn to work around that. And, in those situations as well, I guess a determination would have to be made, maybe between a combination between a medical expert and the jurist, if we're talking from an Islamic legal perspective, to see, does this person, is this particular situation one in which they have the ability to exert control, or are they just unable? Is it unfair to hold them to that standard? You had mentioned that some...
What's very interesting to me is that in American law, the measure is whether you can differentiate between right and wrong, even if you can just do so as an abstract matter. And this issue comes up all the time with serial killers who seem to be incapable of stopping. But nevertheless, in American law, it no defense, and it's not even considered in mitigation, that they have sustained brain injuries or that they have impulse control problems. As long as they can differentiate between right and wrong, you apply the full punitive measure of law. And in fact, there have been many people who are sentenced to death or get life sentences without possibility of parole. And in fact, there are a lot of studies, legal studies, about the fact that if there is evidence that there's impulse control problems, then that becomes grounds for denying people parole or the possibility of parole, basically indefinitely. So, I mean, it is, when it comes to the criminal, the application of criminal law, things become quite complicated, because at the same time, if they are truly incapable of controlling their behavior, then we're really not rehabilitating them, we're just protecting society by keeping them away from others and doing it under the guise of punitive measures. Now, in all of these issues, I mean, one of I'm always struck by, well, if it is biological, why is it that certain societies seems to be plagued by compulsive criminal behavior like serial killers far more than other societies? Why do we, I mean, Muslim world doesn't have that many serial killers, thank God. Now, of course, it might be that they join ISIS and they end up serial killing anyway. I mean, I don't know. It might they end up being suicide bombers, and that's their way of, I don't know. But these are all serious, I mean, these are all the types of issues that I think remain. In the West, there's a considerable amount of literature discussing the moral, philosophical, there is the field of moral, the psychology and philosophy has achieved a certain level of synchronization in a lot of academic literature. But I get the sense that Muslims are far behind, and I'm not sure why. And I'm not sure if that's true.
Yes. Omar, in the story that you mentioned about the Sahabi who drank wine, there's another riwayah in which the Sahaba curse him, and the Prophet says to them, don't curse him, for he loves Allah and he loves his messenger. Now, my question to you is with regard to damage to the frontal lobe. Is there any indication as to the level upon which those types of individuals tend to identify with any religious belief or not? In other words, is that diminished ability here to control impulses, etc., does that translate into anything that's veering toward unbelief or whatever you want to? In other words, disengagement from the very enterprise of seeing themselves as bound to God by some degree of accountability. So is it antithetical to religiousness? I mean, we saw in the case of the Sahabi, he couldn't control his drinking, but he remained religious.
Yes.
And the Prophet said, he loves Allah and he loves his messenger. Is there any indication for these people who are frontally damaged with regard to their religiosity?
That's a fascinating question. Generally, I don't know if that particular research has been done, but generally speaking, I would say no, that there's no indication, like that there's no interference with the religious sensibility. Primarily because, as Abdullah mentioned, there's a sort of primordial desire within the human brain to connect to a higher power. And that a lot of these primordial, pre-verbal, subconscious kind of impulses within the human, they tend to be more related to the subcortex of the brain, which are the older structures within the brain. Some people call it more like the reptilian side, or it's something that I mean, we don't even have to go to brain damage. I'll give you a perfect example of people who have faulty frontal lobes. Teenagers. And any of you that are parents, you know this. The limbic system, the subcortex, the emotional center of your brain, the part where you feel an emotional connection to stimuli, where you feel passion, that is done developing by the age of 15. The frontal lobe, where you make decisions and you weigh consequences and you plan and you inhibit impulses and you think about higher order functioning, that does not complete its developmental course until the age of 25. So from that adolescent period, you have a mismatch between feeling love and passion and emotion like an adult, but your ability to guide it and regulate it and make decisions is still, it needs guidance, it needs development.
Just two very quick comments. First of all, I mean, the reason I asked that first question had to do with I think you brought it up earlier about, Muslims feeling that somehow to have a mental health issue means that there's a deficiency in your religiosity. Mm-hmm. And clearly that would militate against that very notion. And I think that that's something that may help people to overcome some of the stigma, or certainly some of the fear about what's happening to me as a Muslim if I have this mental health issue. The other comment I want to make is with regard to the teenagers. I think that within the community, we do a job on parents, all of us, because you got teenagers, like you said, who are not even developed yet, and therefore will have these impulse management issues. And then instead of being supportive of each other as parents, we're very judgmental of the parents. Mm-hmm. Right? And it makes the burden doubly impossible to reach. So I mean, this kind of, spreading of literacy might do us a lot of good as a community in terms of how we more effectively manage.
Yeah, to understand these things. I mean, like, the car rental agencies, they figured that out a long time ago. You have to be 25 years old. But that was for lucrative purposes, that was just they realized the risk was higher to rent a car to someone under the age of 25 because of the decisions they'd make on the road. But for us, as a community, yes, to help to understand this, to understand, but you can still have a sense of who your Lord is, what your purpose in life is, where your passions lie, the idea of connecting to the light, as Sheikh Hassan mentioned, the nur ala nur, that you can have that from the age of puberty. Then you're set, you're ready to go, but you still need some guidance and some things to develop, but the passion is there, and do we hold them accountable? Still, yeah, we do. We hold them accountable, but we also understand that there are certain stages in life that people need guidance for. I always think that's amazing that the Prophet ﷺ didn't marry until the age of 25. We're expecting young people to make huge life decisions, at age 18, 19, and I'm not sure if the brain is ready for that yet. And what are all the emotional consequences of, the profession you choose, what major are you going to be, what are you going to do, who are you going to marry, all these kind of major life decisions. I don't know how we got onto this topic.
Jazakumullah khair for a very informative session. So I have a question for Dr. Khaled. I was intrigued by what you said about your opinion is that the aql is seated in the brain. Am I correct? So this is something I struggled with when I'm reading the Quran, because there's a specific ayah in the Quran that talks about أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونُ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. And I always so I went back and I checked all where yaqiluna is. This is the only one that mentions that aql is, related to the heart. So I wanted to understand, maybe explain to us more, why are you of the opinion that the aql is seated in the brain, especially in context with this particular area?
This is a good question, and it's in mentioning this ayah, instance, Tafsir al-Razi on this particular ayah has a very fascinating discussion, if I'm remembering the right tafsir. But even someone like Rashid Rida talks about it as well in his Tafsir al-Manar. Anyway, the way that some of it is that the way that the qalb, the heart, undergoes a process of ta'aqqul, or al-aqliya, qalbiya as they call it, is different than the aql al-asbab, or alam al-asbab. That when the Quran refers to the heart as undergoing ta'aqqul, or ya'quluna biha, as the expressions, it means that a tapping into an innate instinctive sense of awareness that is imbued in us in our creation, and that is clouded over by our hawa, our attempt to, our tendency to become attracted to whimsies and lose sight of the essential truth of things. And that's the sense in which ya'qiluna biha, that is meant here. That it's very much the wedding of the, Sheikh Qazwini said, the wedding of the heart and the nafs in the sense of the perception of the fu'ad. Now, there is a debate, and you'll find it even in Hamid al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, where he talks about which is capable of true perception or greater perception. Is it the al-aql al-mudabbir, the rational mind, or is it al-fu'ad wal-qalb, the aqlaniyat al-fu'ad wa aqlaniyat al-qalb? Now, Sheikh Hamid al-Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin ends up arguing that in fact the fu'ad has the ability for more authentic perception, truer perception, than the aql al-mudabbir, than the rational mind. But he's tapping into an extensive debate in the Islamic tradition, when, on the other hand, this was one of the main issues of difference between him and Ibn Rushd, because Ibn Rushd ultimately argued that relying on the fu'ad as the ultimate adjudicator of truth opens the door for extreme subjectivity, and that rational faculties must ultimately be the final judge as to whether the heart is drawn in the wrong direction or in the right direction. To be honest with you, I consider the intellect like the driver in a car. The heart is like the motor of the car. One can't work without the other. And the best driver in the world, if they have a bad motor, they're not going to get anywhere. And a great motor, the best motor in the world, still needs a safe driver. Otherwise, they're going to end up with a disaster. So I don't see it as exclusively this or exclusively that. Ultimately, Razi is the one that I'm drawn the most to here, because he says, well, it depends on what types of issues. If you are looking at issues of everything that has to do with perception of the truth of the divine, the fu'ad must be the ultimate decider, the decisive element. But if you are looking at aqlaniyat, everything that has to do with causation, the laws of causation, it must be the aql. Otherwise, you will tend to be fooled by superstition and magic and soothsayers and so on. And I think that division is ultimately, in the most basic way, is the truth. I don't trust philosophical paradigms when it comes to the ilahiyat, to everything in which the divine is involved. The heart has a perception and ability to see things, to see ultimate truth that the intellect can reason and reason, and I've met enough brilliant geniuses in my life, but when it comes to God, they're idiots. And you know, they reason through the best thing in the world, but they just have a mental block, and often the mental block is their ego. And the ego just makes them brilliant mathematical thinkers, scientific thinkers, and so on. And I've also met extremely pious, perceptive people who have a serious handicap by their lack of analytical abilities. And so they're quite kind. You know, I love to have them for dinner. I love to spend time with them. But their lack of analytical abilities in our day and age is an embarrassment. They cannot discourse intelligently with. And as a community, we have a great responsibility to nourish both and to know that the happiness of a human being, kimya as-sa'ada, as Ghazali puts it, is a healthy, robust elements on both sides of the coin.